from someone. It's fantastic. We're going to keep moving along, ladies and gentlemen, though. We are going to move from Upper Harbour all the way to Te Atatu. We are going to welcome, I'm going to say this, I've been wanting to say this all day, the court is in session. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Simon Court.
Court with you, please. Good morning, kia ora tātou. I'm Simon Court, ACT candidate for Te Atatu. My family has been in New Zealand for almost 200 years. They were missionaries, pioneers, merchants, farmers, builders, accountants and engineers. One of my grandfathers built a ski club on Mount Ruapehu with his mates. It's still there today, enjoyed for over 60 years by families. My other grandfather was a former fighter pilot who still wanted to fly after the war. With his mates, they bought a two-seat glider kit set from Britain, and they each built a section in their garages, apart from my grandfather, who built his in the family living room. And they both built sailboats in their Auckland backyards. That was pretty normal stuff in my family. We're innovators, free thinkers, we're people who know what it takes to get things done, and we're not afraid to take a calculated risk. Perhaps that's why I feel I'm among friends today. I've worked as a civil and environmental engineer for 23 years for contractors, for consultants and for local government. I've worked on complex road and highway projects in Auckland and Wellington, and in Fiji I worked with Chinese government contractors on major projects in remote and difficult conditions. As an engineer in local government, I managed investigation, design and remediation of Auckland's most dangerous closed landfills. I've worked on the best landfills and the worst landfills. I worked to clean up toxic timber treatment chemicals and dioxins found in Agent Orange. Did you know that toxic defoliant sprayed all over Vietnam was made right here in New Zealand? Because there were no clean-up regulations back then, they took a risk-based approach to demonstrate to the satisfaction of their community and their regional council that those sites would be safe after the clean-up. Those companies cleaned up using technology not even considered by government at that time. And they cleaned up because it was the right thing to do. And that leads me to the theme of what I'd like to talk to you about today. Now, colleagues and friends have asked me, Simon, why politics and why ACT? Well, that's not just because politics needs more engineers. I'm also a radical environmentalist. Don't worry, I'm not about to chain myself to an oil rig, climb a chimney stack wearing blue paint, or glue myself to the road, because those behaviours are no longer radical, those behaviours are in fact mainstream. We know it, right? We know it. It's on TV, on the 6 o'clock news, at least once a week. No, I'm a radical environmentalist because I'm a rational environmentalist. The Green Movement, cheered on by an unthinking media, abandoned the environment and conservation long ago in favour of climate economics and social control. Yeah. So, mainstream politicians and media often quote Greenpeace and Extinction Rebellion as experts without ever questioning the nonsense they are spouting. Why, you ask? Because in Parliament and in your local councils, being a climate activist or wanting to ban cars from busy retail areas is considered totally normal. I am speaking from experience here. What is radical now is to propose real solutions to environmental problems that are not all about taxes and regulations and banning things. So I'm a radical environmentalist because I believe in the natural rights of the individual. The natural right to life, liberty and property. And I believe before a government grants itself more rights, their duty is to uphold our natural rights. Because ultimately, as citizens, we know that our rights go hand in hand with real responsibilities. That shouldn't be radical, but it is. I'm radical because I believe that farmers, business and communities should lead conservation efforts, but in a partnership with government, not under threat of prosecution or persecution from bureaucrats who make no effort to understand their way of life. I'm a radical because I believe that business and communities are best placed to solve our worst environment and infrastructure problems through innovation and a partnership with government, not by heavy-handed, counterproductive regulation. Business and landowners have skin in the game. They will invest in doing the right thing because that's what their customers want. And as anyone who's actually run a small business knows, the customers are always right. My experience working as an environmental and civil engineer for 23 years has shown me that responsible business, led by smart people, should be allowed to innovate and show the government what the solutions are. As an engineer, I've worked for business that actually adopted a much higher international standard for its operations because that was the best way to manage their risk. So when friends and colleagues ask me, Simon, why are you standing for ACT? Well, I tell them I'm standing for ACT because ACT is the party of radical reform, the party which takes on the most difficult problems. I'm standing for ACT because ours is the party that puts its trust not in government, but in you, the citizen, the business owner, and the hard-working taxpayer. We need to take a radical approach to solve the most difficult problems in the environment, in transport, and with our broken and lacking infrastructure. In short, yes, we need to change our future. The path we've gone down since the 1991 RMA has led us to 3.5 million tonnes of waste going to landfill every year. The RMA lets councils like Auckland and Wellington give themselves 25-year consents to spill raw sewage onto beaches and waterways. And the RMA is being used as a bludgeon. It's being used to force farmers and landowners to abandon their farm environmental plans based on their local catchment and rivers and real soil science, and instead submit to a government plan, a straitjacket that sidelines the wishes of our local communities and businesses which produce our food and wealth. And I, for one, I'm standing here today to say enough is enough. It's time to act. So you may ask, how did an engineer like Simon come to this radical conclusion? Because engineers are generally regarded as steady as she goes types, right? Well, before I was an engineer, I started a degree in history and politics. It was Russian Revolution, Stalin and Trotsky and the Cold War. I went on the odd protest march because it was much more fun than lectures. And in the innocence of youth, I had my share of indiscretions. I even voted Green a couple of times. But David said he won't hold it against me. He tells me the ACT Party believes in redemption from even the most egregious of sins. But to return to my student days for a moment, while I was sitting in dusty lecture theatres and playing protester, half a world away, students my age rose up and they tore down the Berlin Wall with their bare hands. Those people were prepared to die for their freedom. So this was no longer a laughing matter to me. It seemed pretty inspiring, so after a while, I quit my arts degree and I went to see for myself. West Berlin was glitzy and modern, charming and traditional at the same time. At Checkpoint Charlie, where captured spies were exchanged between East and West, I marvelled at all the ways our fellow humans had tried and often died to escape their so-called socialist paradise. Using high-tension power lines for a flying fox escape is still the highlight for me, and it confirms pretty much everything you've seen in a Bond movie is real. But as you see parts of the Berlin Wall preserved, you cannot miss the warning from history to those who would take their freedom for granted. As I went further east, I saw workers and elderly people pushing wheelbarrows full of coal. Then the tar, actual tar. I saw workers ladle hot tar from a road onto a road from a cauldron, then scatter gravel over the sticky mess to effect some kind of road repair. So let us not forget, socialism was not just tyranny, poverty, it was an environmental disaster. And I'm not just talking about the Trabant, that East German plastic car powered by a big four-stroke lawnmower engine, blowing more smoke than a student flat on a Friday night. The eastern cities were ugly, crowded, dimly lit, covered in soot and grime, broken roads, few footpaths. I remember the air was blue with exhaust smoke. From trains passing through towns and villages, I saw factories spewing industrial waste into the so-called Blue Danube, on its way to the more aptly named Black Sea. When I hiked in the Tatras Mountains, similar to our Tongariro National Park, small rubbish fires smouldered in places because park rangers had no other options. And as I travelled closer to the border with Ukraine, other backpackers told me to stay out. It was still highly radioactive after Chernobyl. I don't think it could have made a starker contrast to our clean, green New Zealand. It also struck me that New Zealand was a very wealthy country and how important that prosperity is to our way of life. So back in New Zealand, with a new appreciation for this incredible country, I switched to environmental science and then studied engineering while I worked full-time. I wanted to put everything I'd learned to good use. So now when people ask me why ACT and why now, I tell them big government and heavy-handed regulation has failed to solve our worst environmental, transport and infrastructure problems, and that it always would fail. I tell them we need radical reform of the RMA and to replace that bad law with good law that works with business to solve their own problems through technical innovation. I tell them we have a responsibility to tread lightly on the earth, but that government is too often the cause of, not the solution to our problems. Where my boys are growing up on the Manukau Harbour, you often see fur seals, sometimes killer whales, and sharks are always lurking. That once heavy, polluted harbour is again a playground for kayakers like me and a source of kai moana for fishers, but it's not clean by any means. Watercare discharges around 400 million litres of treated sewage every day into that harbour. And every year there are hundreds of raw sewage overflows from council's network into our streams and harbours, beaches around Auckland. We know that is wrong. Yet the Resource Management Act lets councils in places like Auckland and Wellington get away with it because they can ask for consents which are readily granted. That needs to change. And in my area, waste management and landfills, the RMA bans modern incinerators and makes getting a permit for waste to energy almost impossible. As a result, we now bury 3.5 million tonnes of waste in landfills every single year. And how does big regulating government think they're going to solve this one? Well, the Greens and the government are rolling out huge landfill taxes. They're doing that right now. It will add $50 to $60 a tonne for every household and business in this country. That is wrong to impose $200 million of cost every year onto households and businesses, while the RMA denies New Zealand access to the very technology that solved Europe's landfill crisis in under 15 years. So we need a government whose instinct is technology over taxation, innovation instead of ideology, and a fresh approach that works with the community to change our future for the better. And best of all, we in ACT have a radical vision of how to solve that particular environmental problem. Dump the RMA altogether. Yeah. Right. It is ACT that is standing up for radical reform to replace that bad law with good law. It is ACT that wants to protect the environment, not pay lip service to it with placards and public relations. It is ACT who will instigate the kind of business-led innovation we need to solve our worst environmental problems. Real solutions to the challenges we face and an end to the old red versus blue duopoly that has owned New Zealand politics for too long. few weeks ago, I spent time with a farming couple who lead the way with farm environmental management on their award-winning Te Kuiti property. Starting around 5 years ago, they fenced waterways and regenerating bush, and they planted a wide variety of native trees and shrubs. Their plan is a partnership with local farm community groups, supported with good science from their regional council, their suppliers, and from local laboratories. It's quite a partnership. I saw a 40-year-old short fin eel, kura, freshwater crayfish, and freshwater fish scooped from the creek right next to where we stood on a working farm. That is real leadership, investing your own profits back into the land and water with real returns measured in increased biodiversity. And they didn't need government help to do it. Relying on the government to solve our environmental problems, our transport issues, our infrastructure issues will always be a failed approach. We've seen it so many times here and around the world, but small business, communities and citizens can solve those problems. And you know why? Because we always have. That is because when a business puts up the solution, invests their own money to make it work, we can be more confident they will succeed than taxing and regulating that business. All government needs to do is to set the right framework for those partnerships and simply get the hell out of the way. So, in the aftermath of COVID-19, New Zealand has to focus on growing our productivity and our wealth as a priority in order to pay for the type of pristine environment we aspire to and to deliver the vital infrastructure that is lacking. And you've heard from Brooke. Wasn't she fantastic, by the way? ACT will develop good urban development law to allow our cities to reach their potential, which includes a much simpler process to deliver vital infrastructure, without the kind of political interference that leads to a light rail fiasco. That is a project no one asked for, and no one in my industry has a clue how it could even work. And the real tell with that one is that no credible engineering business stood up to deliver it. Very soon, if more of us are prepared to stand up and be counted, there will be more ACT MPs like me in Parliament, people who do understand what it takes to deliver real-world solutions to the most difficult problems we face, on environmental, on transport, and on infrastructure. So I say to you today, it's not enough to quietly vote. We need you to tell your friends and family and workmates, your taxi driver and your hairdresser, tell them why ACT is different. Let them know we are listening, and there are hundreds of thousands of us out there. Let them know there is hope for our future, that if they put their trust in ACT, they can change their future. And please tell them, give your party vote to ACT in this election. Thank you.